In the autumn of 1838, in the town of Moundsville, then still part of Virginia, a local businessman named Abelard Tomlinson stood at the mouth of a shaft. His hired men had spent weeks cutting into the largest earthen mound in the country. It rose nearly 70 feet above the bottomland along the Ohio River, a smooth green cone that farmers had plowed and grazed cattle around for 2 generations without anyone opening it. Tomlinson's crew drove a horizontal tunnel into its base and sank a second shaft down from the summit, and somewhere in the packed clay between the 2 openings, they broke into a timber-lined burial vault that had not felt daylight in more than 2,000 years. Torches went in first, then men, crouched under a roof of split logs that had somehow held the weight of the mound above it since long before Tomlinson's own grandparents were born. Inside lay human remains, arranged with evident care, strands of shell beads, worked copper ornaments, and according to several accounts from the men present that day, a small flat sandstone disc marked with rows of characters nobody on sight could read. The story that came out of that hole in the ground moved faster than anyone could check it against what was actually inside. Within months, newspapers as far away as Boston and Charleston were describing not a burial mound raised by the ancestors of people still living in the same river valley, but the tomb of a vanished race, older and greater than any nation known to have walked that ground since, a people some writers were already calling giants. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Grave Creek Mound, as it came to be known, was not an isolated curiosity, and it had not gone up quickly. It was built by the people archaeologists now call the Adena, over multiple stages spanning perhaps a century, sometime in the final centuries before the Common Era. It rose the same way every mound in the Ohio Valley rose, basket by basket, one load of earth carried on a worker's back and tipped onto the growing pile, with deer scapular hoes and woven cane baskets doing the work no wheelbarrow or draft animal was available to do. Excavators later estimated the finished structure held close to 60,000 cubic yards of earth, packed with enough discipline that its slopes had held their pitch for 2,000 years before Tomlinson's men ever touched a shovel to it. Grave Creek was the largest of its kind in the country, but it was one mound among many thousands. Ohio alone is thought to have held something on the order of 10,000 mounds and earthworks before European settlement, ranging from modest burial cones a few feet high to earthen walls enclosing hundreds of acres apiece, laid out using sightlines and pacing that produced a geometric accuracy modern surveyors would later confirm with instruments those original builders never had. Archaeologists estimate that raising a mound on the scale of Grave Creek required the coordinated labor of hundreds of people across multiple building seasons, organized well enough that the work continued year after year without the layers ever slipping out of alignment. To the farmers, land agents, and townspeople who kept encountering these structures while clearing fields through the 1700s and 1800s, the scale was difficult to reconcile with the native nations they were, in many of those same decades, actively pushing off that same land. That difficulty produced an answer, and the answer took a specific and recurring shape. Rather than credit the mounds to the ancestors of the Shawnee, the Miami, the Osage, or any of the dozen other nations whose oral histories and living presence connected them directly to this ground, popular writers, newspaper editors, and more than a few credentialed men of science reached for someone else entirely. Descendants of the lost tribes of Israel, arriving by sea and building in the manner of the Old World, was one favored account, and it found its way directly into Joseph Smith's Book of Mormon, published in 1830, only 8 years before Tomlinson's crew opened Grave Creek. A wandering Welsh prince named Madoc, said to have crossed the Atlantic centuries ahead of Columbus, was another candidate. Toltecs pushed north out of Mexico filled in for some writers. Wandering Norsemen filled in for others, and running underneath nearly every version of the story was the claim that this vanished people had simply been larger than ordinary men. American newspapers spent the better part of the 1800s running a steady stream of reports, describing giant skeletons pulled from mounds in Ohio, Tennessee, West Virginia, and beyond. Some described running 7, 8, even 9 feet in length. In 1869, in Cardiff, New York, workers digging a well struck what was reported as a 10-foot petrified man, and thousands of paying visitors lined up to view it before it was exposed as a gypsum carving, commissioned and buried there the year before by a tobacconist named George Hull. The giant at Cardiff was fake from the day it went into the ground. The appetite that made people want to believe in one was not. Some of the era's more careful observers tried to correct the record even as it was being written around them. In 1845 and 1846, Ephraim Squier, a newspaper editor, and Edwin Davis, a physician, surveyed hundreds of mounds and earthworks across Ohio using nothing more than a surveyor's transit and chain, mapping sites from the Hopewell Mound Group to the Great Walled Enclosure at Fort Ancient, with a precision archaeologists still cross-check their own fieldwork against today. Their book, Ancient Monuments of the Mississippi Valley, published in 1848, became the first volume the Smithsonian Institution ever issued under its own name, and it treated the earthworks as engineering achievements worth documenting exactly, rather than mysteries worth embellishing further. But even Squier and Davis, working with the best measurements available anywhere at the time, stopped short of stating plainly that the ancestors of contemporary native nations had built what they were so carefully surveying. Their book laid out the evidence without settling the argument attached to it, and for another 3 decades after its publication, the vanished race kept its seat in American school books, lecture halls, and popular fiction, running in parallel with the nations who were, during those same decades, being pushed west of the Mississippi under the terms of a removal policy signed into law in 1830. The record did not close on its own. It closed because the federal government eventually paid to close it. In 1881, Congress appropriated funds for the Bureau of Ethnology, under its director John Wesley Powell, to settle the mound question through fieldwork instead of speculation. Powell handed the assignment to Cyrus Thomas, a botanist and entomologist with no fixed position on the matter going in, and placed him in charge of what became known inside the Bureau as the Division of Mound Exploration. Over roughly the following decade, Thomas and his field assistants examined more than 2,000 mounds and earthworks spread across 21 states, comparing the pottery styles, pipe forms, burial postures, and tool types recovered from the mounds directly against objects still made and used by native nations at the time of European contact. In several cases, Thomas's teams traced a direct physical line running from an excavated mound to a nearby historic town site still remembered and named by the native nation living closest to it, a continuity no vanished predecessor race could account for. The comparison left the vanished race very little room to stand on. In his final report, delivered to the Bureau in 1894 and running past 700 pages, Thomas stated without hedging that the mounds of the eastern United States had been built by the direct ancestors of the very nations that American writers had spent the preceding 60 years describing as incapable of having built them. By any fair reading, that should have ended the argument. It did not end the myth. Thomas's report circulated among scholars and effectively closed the question inside the discipline of archaeology. It never reached the newspapers, the school books, or the popular imagination with anything like the force the giant skeletons had carried for the better part of a century, and the vanished race kept turning up in magazines and pulp adventure fiction well into the next one. The same dismissal that fell on Grave Creek fell just as hard on earthworks whose sophistication should have made dismissal impossible on its face. Roughly 200 miles northeast, near the present town of Newark, Ohio, the same Hopewell-era builders laid out a set of earthen circles, squares, and an octagon enclosing more than 50 acres, all connected by parallel embankments that once ran for miles across the surrounding countryside. 19th-century observers measured those walls, admired them in print, and still assigned them to the vanished race as a matter of course. It was not until the 1980s, when researchers Ray Hively and Robert Horn systematically tracked the alignment of the Newark octagon against the horizon, that the earthworks gave up what they had been holding the entire time, waiting for anyone to ask the right question. The walls were oriented to track the extreme rising and setting points of the moon across a cycle that repeats roughly every 18 years and 7 months, a cycle that requires sustained recorded observation across multiple human generations to detect at all, let alone build a permanent structure around. The nation confidently ruled incapable of raising Grave Creek Mound was, on the same soil roughly 200 miles away, tracking a lunar cycle that would not be formally catalogued by European astronomy for centuries afterward. For decades, part of that same earthwork sat inside the leased grounds of a private golf course, its ancient embankments doubling as hazards on a course laid out around them, open to paying members, and closed to the public that legally owned the ground beneath it. In recent years, that arrangement has been the subject of a sustained legal effort to return full access to the site to the public and to the descendant nations connected to it. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. Roughly 1,400 miles from Grave Creek, along the Mississippi River near what is now St. Louis, the Mississippian culture that reached its height around the year 1100 built Monks Mound, a platform earthwork rising close to 100 feet and covering more ground at its base than the Great Pyramid at Giza. At its peak, the surrounding city of Cahokia held a population some archaeologists place close to 20,000 people, larger at the time than London. It had a central plaza the size of dozens of football fields, satellite mounds arranged with apparent astronomical intent, and a ring of wooden posts some researchers believe functioned as a solar calendar. 19th century surveyors who documented Monks Mound reached for the same explanation they had reached for at Grave Creek and at Newark. A structure of that scale, in their account, could not belong to the ancestors of the Illini, the Osage, or any of the nations who lived across that same river valley when European settlers arrived to measure it. The same pattern reached directly into the ancestral homelands of the nations who would later be forced out of the southeast entirely. At Etowah, in what is now northern Georgia, and at Moundville, in what is now Alabama, Mississippian-era builders raised platform mounds, plazas, and defensive earthworks on a scale comparable to Cahokia's, centuries before Europeans reached that part of the continent. Etowah's largest mound still rises more than 60 feet above the Etowah River, surrounded by a ditch and palisade line that once ringed the entire town, while Moundville's plaza is bordered by more than 24 separate mounds arranged with a consistency that suggests a single planning authority rather than centuries of unplanned accretion. Both sites sit within the historic homelands of the Muscogee Creek and neighboring nations, and both were, in the standard 19th century telling, attributed to the same vanished predecessor race, rather than to the ancestors of the people whose towns still stood nearby when American surveyors arrived to measure the mounds. The claim was never limited to Ohio or to a single disputed valley. It followed the mound-building tradition everywhere it appeared, from the Ohio River to the Gulf Coast, and it arrived everywhere for the same reason. Back at Grave Creek, the artifact that might have settled its own mystery did the opposite. The small inscribed stone recovered from the burial chamber in 1838 was copied, sketched, and mailed to scholars across 2 continents, and no 2 transcriptions agreed on what the characters said, or even on how many characters there were. The original stone changed hands repeatedly over the following decades, was displayed, misplaced, and reproduced from memory and imperfect casts more than once. By the time serious epigraphers examined the surviving copies in the 20th century, the consensus leaned toward a 19th century fabrication, whether an outright hoax or a well-meaning forgery meant to make an already remarkable mound seem more remarkable still. What is verifiable is narrower and in its way stranger. The stone that supposedly proved a literate vanished race existed cannot today be produced, examined, and confirmed against its own original description. The mound itself, 60,000 cubic yards of basket-carried earth, never required a disputed inscription to prove it was built with intention, organization, and enormous collective labor. It required only measurement, which is exactly what its actual builders were denied for most of the century that followed its opening. That denial was not only aesthetic reluctance to credit scale to the people standing in front of the surveyors. It arrived, decade after decade, at precisely the moment it proved most convenient. Congress passed the Indian Removal Act in 1830, and through the 10 years that followed, the Cherokee, the Choctaw, the Muscogee Creek, the Chickasaw, and the Seminole were forced from homelands that included some of the very earthworks under discussion in the era's newspapers, walked west under military escort in a removal that killed an estimated 4,000 Cherokee alone before it was finished. A story holding that the true builders of this continent's monuments had already been conquered and replaced once, by the ancestors of the nations now being marched out of the way, made a second removal easier to narrate as history simply repeating itself, rather than history being actively made by the government doing the removing. The mound builders had supposedly vanished before. The present nations, in that telling, were never more than the previous conquerors, no more entitled to the land than whoever they had supposedly displaced. Cyrus Thomas's 1894 report undercut that narrative completely. Decades after the policy it had helped make palatable had already run its course, and the nations it targeted had already been forced across the Mississippi. In the western mountains of North Carolina, in the middle of the modern town of Franklin, a single platform mound called Nikwasi still stands on the bank of the Little Tennessee River, roughly where it has stood for close to 1,000 years. Unlike Grave Creek, and unlike most of Ohio's 10,000 mounds, plowed flat or quarried for road fill over 2 centuries of development, Nikwasi survived, first under private ownership, and later, for most of the 20th century, under the town's own care, a low-grassed rise now flanked by storefronts, and a public sidewalk that circles its base. It was never a mystery to the people who lived around it. Nikwasi was built by Mississippian-era predecessors and became the anchor of an important historic Cherokee town of the same name, one of the town's Cherokee tradition calls a mother town, and the mound itself carries its own recorded history, set down by the ethnographer James Mooney around 1900 in his collection of Cherokee oral tradition. Mooney recorded accounts of the Nunahi, a people described as living inside the mound and emerging to defend Nikwasi in times of danger, an origin account that explained the mound's significance in the Cherokee's own words decades before any outside observer thought to ask who had built it. There was no vanished race attached to Nikwasi, no inscribed stone requiring a translation nobody could agree on, no newspaper report of giant bones pulled from the ground, only a nation that had already described, in its own oral tradition, exactly what the mound was and why it mattered, long before any outsider raised the question. In recent years, stewardship of the mound has moved toward the eastern band of Cherokee Indians directly, through a formal partnership with the surrounding local governments, an arrangement that returns something close to formal authority over Nikwasi to the descendant nation with the deepest continuous connection to the site. What the record shows, set beside what popular imagination insisted on for the better part of a century, is not complicated. The people who built Grave Creek Mound, the Newark Earthworks, Monks Mound at Cahokia, Etowah, Moundville, and Nikwasi were not erased and replaced by some vanished people who arrived before the nation's Congress marched west in the 1830s. They were, according to every artifact comparison Cyrus Thomas's survey was able to make, the direct ancestors of those same nations, building on the same ground their descendants were later removed from at gunpoint. The giants were newspaper copies sold by the column inch. The lost tribes were a story built to serve a different book's purpose. Cyrus Thomas's 700 pages sat in a government archive for 100 years doing the quiet work that Squier and Davis's careful surveys and every ploughed field and every dismissed oral tradition could not do on their own until someone with the authority of an act of Congress behind him wrote the conclusion down plainly. The mound that still stands in the middle of Franklin, North Carolina, needed no lost race, no lost continent, and no inscribed stone to explain who raised it, because the people who built it, and their descendants standing on the same riverbank today, never stopped being able to say so themselves. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.